Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. It's another one of our All Things Africa edition. We continue to explore the history and current affairs of each African country, and we continue to explore Southern Africa, the Southern African region. And in this episode, we are exploring our second to last country, not only in Southern Africa, but mainland Africa. And it's been a long time coming. We are going to look at the history and current affairs of the country known as South Africa. And who better to teach us about this country or any African country than our historical guide, our tour guide, Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan African Newswire and Black Agenda Report. Abayomi is a longtime historian, journalist, Pan Africanist, leftist activist, and anti-imperialist campaigner. And just before we begin, a reminder to our audience to, as always, please share widely all of One Plus One's content, past and present episodes, our playlists. I'm doing even shorter versions of our playlists and help us overcome the far right algorithms and the dominant monopoly Western corporate state media and pseudo leftist websites have in the social media world by sharing our content. Share us across social media and email. And please donate if you can to One Plus One or PayPal. And if people are having trouble and would prefer a different form of donation, then do get in touch with me at yourismouter at Gmail. And sometimes Facebook blocks my ability to share One Plus One. So again, please share widely. It helps the show immensely. And now on to the topic at hand. So, Abayomi, as always, welcome back to the program. And first question is the following. Tell us, what was South Africa like before the first vicious settler colonial regime of the Boer, the Dutch white supremacists, and later the British Empire? And what were the conditions for the indigenous Africans and the countless different peoples when the Boers came and later the British?
Well, thank you so much for your continuing interests in African history and contemporary African affairs. South Africa, like the rest of the Southern Africa region, has a long history of human settlements, which have been documented over the last 100 years, even by Western scientists, despite the fact they have attempted to distort the actual history of the people. It has come out and come out very strong. In fact, human settlements can be traced back to approximately 2.5 million years ago. There was of course, discovery of the rock paintings, also discovery of fossils of hominids and other forms of ancestors of what is today considered Homo sapiens sapiens. There is, for example, a fossil found of a child in the Daung region of South Africa, which is being dated back several million years. There's also the development of various phases of human development. We talk about the various steps within the Stone Age, going all the way back to 2 million, more than 2 million years ago. Then with the introduction of tools, sharper tools and better tools, this raised the level of human settlements to higher degrees. Later, the so-called Iron Age came about, where you had the development of agriculture and also livestock production and grazing. So by the time that the initial Europeans arrived there in the late 15th century, they were the Portuguese. In 1488, they arrived. They wanted to set up settlements there, but eventually they were overwhelmed by the Boers as well as the British. And this took a period of some 200 to 300 years, but there was always African people there. You had the Khoi, the San people, the so-called Hottentot people. These are all European labels that have been put on African people over the various centuries. But all these people were there. There was migration that was taking place from the east to the west, from more northern eastern regions of South Africa, of the African continent to South Africa. So yes, Africans were there in numbers. They set up their own chieftaincies, nation states, civilizations, and cultures. So, in the concluding decades of the middle decades of the 17th century, around 1652, you had the introduction of the Dutch East India Company. They came in, they brought enslaved Africans from other parts of the continent, as well as Indians and people from the Malay Peninsula. They had slavery in South Africa going all the way back to the mid 17th century. So there's a lot of discussion about settler colonialism and about colonialism and about apartheid, but it's just been, I'd say, in the last 3 decades that more and more research and writing is being done on the legacy of enslavement, African enslavement and Asian enslavement in what is today known as the Republic of South Africa.
Interesting. Uh, continue. And what and how did the how did the Dutch Boer settler colonial regime come to be? And what were the conditions like for the indigenous Africans when the Boers first came? And then talk about and then with that talk about the rise of the British. Don't talk about the Anglo-Boer War just yet, but do talk about the rise of the British, Cecil Rhodes, and what were the conditions already like for the indigenous South Africans when the worst of two worlds of the Boers and the British came.
Yes, there was competition between the Boers and the British over control of South Africa, and they fought wars. But at the same time, the resistance on the part of the African people was fierce, going all the way back to the 16th century. The indigenous people were being forced off their land, and they were being marginalized. And for example, some of the original inhabitants of the country, the Khoisan and others, were brutalized heavily. They were enslaved, and they were marginalized to the point where their resistance took the form of cattle raiding, because people were starving. They were being forced off their land. So they were actually coming around and stealing, not really stealing, but reclaiming, is a more appropriate term, their livestock. And this provided, of course, a rationale for the extermination, large extermination of the Khoisan. And this was taking place during the 18th century. Then at the conclusion of the 18th century, around 1799, because of the scattering of the Khoisan people and because of the theft of land, people migrated and formed other groupings. There was a reconsolidation of human settlements, cultures, and chieftaincies during the 18th and the early 19th century. So beginning around the conclusion of the 18th century, we had the development of what became known as the Kaffir Wars. Now, the term Kaffir is a derogatory term used by the Boers and even the British to denigrate the African people. But they fought back, and it was a series of wars that were fought during the 1800s that brought about the deaths of thousands upon thousands of Africans, the seizure of their land, and also the seizure of their livestock. So this disrupted traditional African chieftaincies and culture. And of course, valiantly during these years, but many of them were killed as a result of superior armaments that were possessed by both the British as well as the Boers. So this reconsolidation continued, and by the 1860s, there was a full onslaught against the Zulu people, the Zulu kingdom. And this resulted in a series of conflicts. Then in 1879, there was the Battle of Islawande, which was a major battle between the British and the Zulu nation. It lasted for months, the initial battles were won by the Zulu people. Their chief, Shishwayo, was very good in mobilizing his people and launching attacks against the British. But the British sent in more armaments, more personnel, and eventually they were able to overwhelm the Zulu nation. They had to compromise the British. Yet in 1906, there was a violent rebellion known as the Bambata Rebellion against the British colonial encapsulation of their people. And that was the last major, at least during that period, armed resistance. Now, there had been resistance prior to that, of course. We talked about Basutoland, King Moshoeshoe I and his people who had defeated the Boers at Thabo Busia in 1858. Then there was the gun war of 1880 and 1881 when the British tried to further enslave or further colonize the Basutu people, but they eventually had to make them a British protectorate. But during this process, massive amounts of land were seized by the Europeans. The Orange Free State, which is actually the Basutu kingdom, that was seized by the Boers. And the Basutu people were confined to the Maloti Mountains and other areas in which they remain today. A similar situation happened to the Xhosa people as well as the Zulu people and other groups. So it took centuries. We're talking about from 1488 when the Portuguese first arrived to 1652 when the Dutch East India Company arrived and brought African enslavement to the region. And also during the 1700s, the further encroachment on the various groups. And then during the 19th century, a series of vicious wars were fought against various peoples throughout the entire region of Southern Africa. So the African people resisted heroically against European enslavement, settler colonialism, as well as classical colonialism, leading all the way up to the early 20th century.
Now, somewhere before the rise of apartheid, which was Jim Crow and settler colonialism on steroids,
Yes.
taken to levels that I think the PA Noir and the Confederates and other white supremacists can only dream of. Tell us about the inter-imperialist war conflict, which was the two Anglo-Boer war. Inter-imperialist war. Now, let's. Now, I don't want to, talk about uh, Ukraine and Russia, but that's a term that some of our fellow anti-imperialists have described the proxy war, Russia versus Western-backed Ukraine, the Western-backed coup government in Ukraine. Some people call it an inter-imperialist war between two rival capitalists. Don't want to get into why I disagree with that, and I know you also disagree with that. But that being said, the two Anglo-Boer wars, that was an inter-imperialist war. So that being said, the British were known for their brutal use of scorched earth and concentration camps, and they inflicted essentially a Holocaust on the Boer people. And while it was horrendous what the British did to the Boer Afrikaners, the indigenous Black South Africans who were resisting both, though some tribes did believe that the British would be that it would be better to side with the British than with the Boers. And so that happened, only to be betrayed by the British, and their conditions in these concentration camps were even more unspeakable than what the Boers were subjected to. And there was even quite all that being said, there was also quite a sizable anti-war, anti-imperialist movement, protest movement against the Anglo-Boer War in the UK, with many denouncing the actions that the British inflicted on both the Boers and Black people. Please, talk to us about that period in time.
Another key element of all of this was the discovery of diamonds and gold in Kimberley initially, and later in the Vaal region of South Africa between the 1860s and 1880s. This changed the whole framework of the world capitalist system because there was extreme demand for cheap African labor. And of course, a lot of people were trafficked into the mines, not only from what is today considered the Republic of South Africa, but other areas throughout the region. So this was a very, very important development during that time period. And then, of course, as that escalated, there was a competition for land, livestock, and also cheap labor, because as these groups, be the Khoisan, the Zulus, the Xhosas, and others, as their land was taken, and as their groups were defeated by the British and the Boers, they became subject peoples, and they became subservient to the European settlers. And they had to work essentially for free. A lot of the people were killed, wiped out through these wars. There was also a major smallpox infestation in South Africa during this time period, during the 1700s and 1800s. And just like with the indigenous people in North America, it took a devastating toll on the people in South Africa as well. So yes, this is what happened. And in between the conclusion of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, there was a huge conflict between the Boers and the British. The British eventually won out, or some people say it was basically a stalemate. And they had to negotiate a settlement. And leading up to the conclusion of the first decade of the 20th century, the Union of South Africa was formed. That was around 1910. So that's how the Union was formed. It was supposed to be an unholy alliance between the Boers and the British, but the African people suffered immensely during this whole period. Their land was taken. Then there were additional legislation under the Union of South Africa, which took even more land. The 1913 Land Act, which basically gave a legal rationale for the dominance of the Europeans over the African people.
And yes, thank you for mentioning that. And I think it's also important to mention that when the Brits won through such sheer brutality over the Boers, were also colonial subjects to the British. But when it came to good old fashioned white supremacy, they were more than willing to collaborate to to be assholes to the black majority people. I'm sorry, I don't have a better term to say
Yeah,
that.
but just to mention
Yeah.
that even though a lot of African people were wiped out in the 18th and 19th century, their societies were dislocated, and the majority of the people were subjected to forced labor. They still outnumbered both the British and the Boers. So this constituted a problem for them. And that's why they had to set up a minority apartheid type system, which was codified after World War II, but it existed long prior to the 1948 apartheid system that was instituted.
You already talked about the Zulu nation. Can you talk to us just a bit more about them when it came to the two Anglo-Boer wars and their leader Shaka Zulu and his epic resistance against both Boers and British, and his epic sort of custard style fight against the English. And I believe he does have a dark side to his story, which some of even his supporters like to downplay. I don't know if that's true or if that's just propaganda, but I'm very curious your response.
Yeah, well, he was much earlier, during
Okay.
the earlier part of the 19th century. And by the time that the Zulu Anglo War took place in earnest in 1879, Shaka had long passed away, but he had successors. And in 1879, it was a man named Siswayo. It's spelled in different ways, but he is a hero, in terms of African history. Even people in this country have named their children after him or adopted his name. Yes, but they were a warrior commando society, and they did tremendous expansion, going all the way back to the early years of the 19th century. And the Amazulu Kingdom and the Kingdom of Basutoland were two of the largest kingdoms, and they were able to avoid outright war among themselves. But at the same time, they were able to consolidate other peoples, particularly under King Mushweshwe. He was able to bring together a number of the chieftaincies and even other nationalities being brought into the Basutu nation. So, yes, it was a period in the 19th century of dispersal, of war, reconsolidation, and also dominance. And also the clash at the end of the 19th and early 20th century between the Boers and the British. But the British had the advantage from the standpoint they had an international kingdom or international imperialist system. They controlled a considerable amount of land in other parts of Africa. Also in Asia, they controlled what was known as Hindustan, which today we would describe as large sections of India. So they had more weapons, they had a formidable navy, and they had a formidable army. So they had the advantage in that regard in terms of being able to get supplies, resources, weaponry, as well as additional soldiers from other parts of the so-called British Empire.
Very quickly, uh, yeah, very briefly, were the Zulus able to put up such an epic fight against the British and the Boers, despite having despite not having the weaponry that both the Boers and the British have? Were they able to put up such an epic fight because they were just very good at surprise attacks, raids, and then taking the weapons of of the people they killed? I assume they had sometimes prisoners of wars who would tell them, "Yeah, they're coming from this." Was that why they put up such a epic fight against the British and the Brits?
Yeah, they were able to mobilize thousands upon thousands of fighters, and many of them were not afraid to die. When the British came to invade their territory, they fought them head on. And in fact, there was a movie that was shown just 2 days ago on the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. It was shown over the television network that's owned by Pam Grier, the African American actress
Oh,
and
okay,
producer.
interesting,
She has her
interesting.
own television network called Soul Flicks, and that was one of the 24 hours, 7 days a week. They show classic films. A lot of them are black films. They have some kung fu movies as well, but
Yes,
from the
I know
1970s.
our people have a soft spot for that genre of Chinese Hong Kong films. Interesting,
Bruce Lee
interesting.
and the others from Seattle. Yeah, but anyway, yeah. So they show how the war developed. It was fairly good film. I was quite surprised. They did show how Shiswayo and others were able to mobilize and organize and fight the British. But eventually, the British were able to overcome the numbers through their superior weaponry and supplies and wealth and so forth. But yes, they had their own techniques, military techniques that were quite effective in the 19th century, although they were eventually overturned. But in 1906, there was another rebellion led by a man named Bambata, and that's considered the last really armed rebellion on the part of the African people against the European settler colonialists. After that, the terms of resistance shifted because of their dominance.
Interesting, fascinating. Tell us about Cecil Rhodes. We've already talked about him before, but we can't talk about present day South
Right.
Africa without talking about Cecil Rhodes. So tell us about Cecil Rhodes, and the start of the rapacious, evil mining industry of South Africa, and then tell us about how white supremacy, white nationalism, white Boer nationalism or Afrikaner nationalism from the Dutch speaking Protestant churches, how that helped advance what became apartheid and the unique racist ideology and socio-economic racial capitalism that became the pillar of apartheid.
Yes, but we also have to keep in mind that the British has their own tradition of racism, ideological racism as well. And the whole concept of imperialism that was advanced by numerous British leaders. We could talk about people like Chamberlain. Uh, we could talk about Lugard, who was in Nigeria, and Lord Balfour, who in 1917 wrote a letter which has been used as the legal basis for the creation of the Zionist entity in Palestine. So, yes, they had a tremendous history of not only racism, but ideological racism, where they justified and rationalized their dominance over Africans, Asians, and anyone else they would consider inferior. Even the Irish, for example, and the Scottish and the Welsh were subjected to this same type of imperialism and racism during over a period of many centuries. So yes, now as I said, Africans resisted, and there were organizations that were formed even as early as the 1900s. You had the so-called African Peoples Organization, which was formed around 1902, which was an organization that was heavily dominated by mixed race people, because they, as a result of the rapacious activity of the Boers and also the British, they had enslaved and raped African women, and the offsprings of these groups were also enslaved as well. Now, a lot of them fled due to the conditions under which they lived, and some of them even integrated into other groups, other African chieftaincies. But then others were utilized as a buffer zone, so to speak, between the masses of African people and the European settler colonialists. So you had the African Peoples Organization that was formed during the first decade of the 20th century. And then in 1912, there was the formation of the South African Native National Congress. Now, this group was unique from the standpoint that their idea was to bring together all the different nationalities in the region. You have people from Eswatini, what is known as Eswatini today, then known as Swaziland, Basutoland, and others. The Zulus as others. And in 1912, they formed this organization, which later became the African National Congress. Mm-hmm. So the African Peoples Organization largely focused on more well-off, educated people of mixed race ancestry, although they did have, people from other organizations as well.
Yeah.
So in 1912, of course, they were the South African National Native Congress, later known as the ANC, was formed. And a lot of it was in response to the proposed 1913 Land Act, which codified the seizure of land from the African people, placing it firmly in the hands of the European settler colonialists.
But talk a bit more about the ideology of apartheid and then the conditions that the indigenous Africans, also South Asians, and what's called the colored community, which I do have a question about later on. But talk to us about how that Boer Afrikaner nationalism. Some of it, there were legitimate grievances because of how the British won the Anglo-Boer wars, but how these Dutch-speaking churches, these Dutch Protestant, what they call the Dutch Reformed churches, had a lot of fire and brimstone in their in their sermons about what the British did to the Boers, and how that ideology, with along with with just the racial uh, capitalism that the British always had throughout all of their colonies, how both of those hideous ideologies merged into the unique evil system of white supremacy, racial capitalism, uh, the grotesque social, capitalism on steroids that was the apartheid system.
The Boers, who initially came from the Netherlands, uh, that country, even though during particularly the 17th century, had a lot of colonies. They gathered a tremendous amount of wealth through their corporations. Yet they were superseded later by other imperialist countries, particularly the British and the French.
Yes, in fact, sorry to interrupt. The Brits were known for often stealing my father's country's colonies, whether it was New York, which used to be New Amsterdam,
Yeah,
New
Amsterdam.
Zealand, New
Yes.
Zealand. That's a Dutch name, Zeeland,
Mhm.
and yes, and then the British, stole, yeah, from the Boers. So yeah.
Yeah, that is the real inter-imperialist rivalry that had developed. I talked about the Portuguese landing there first. They were not able to sustain themselves against the Dutch and the British. So the Boer trekkers, who were left there basically on their own, uh, were desperate for land, livestock, and cheap labor. So they considered, just like the European settlers in North America, they considered this territory as theirs. It was similar to the manifest destiny outlook of the area of North America, where the indigenous people are totally overlooked, and African people are considered cheap labor for exploitation, and they have some inherent right given to them by a higher power to dominate. And that was the same ideology that prevailed in North America, also prevailed as well in Southern Africa and other parts of Africa. We talked about even Algeria was a settler colony on the part of the French, who brought in hundreds of thousands of French people as well as Italians. And they considered themselves as being overseas French territory. So the British considered South Africa, Northern Rhodesia, and Southern Rhodesia as their territory, that they controlled it. And nobody, they wouldn't have it any other way. So they had to be dominant, and they had to exercise their dominance over the African people in those territories. So the ideology grew out of that same European outlook that had been pervasive, going all the way back at least to the early 15th century. But you had World War One. Now the British were more dominant after the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910. Uh, Africans were conscripted into the British Army during World War One. In fact, in Nyasaland, and we had talked about this earlier, which became Malawi, there was a rebellion by a man named John Chilembwe in 1915 in opposition to the conscription of Africans into the British Army to fight during World War One. So that was resistance even against World War One in Africa. So also there was at the conclusion of World War One, Britain was still a dominant imperial power, although it was somewhat weakened as a result of the war. The United States was able to emerge as an even stronger industrial power. They had more control of larger swaths of land, and they did not get into World War One until 1917. They held off during the first period between 1914 and 1917. There was a lot of opposition against the war even in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
even among the capitalists, because they saw it as an enemy of their system, that it could potentially destroy their workforce. So they were against it. But however, in 1917, when they were shown, particularly Woodrow Wilson, that they could actually profit from the war, they got into it. And it ended, of course, in 1918. And after that, you had the Paris peace talks, the weakening of Germany and other countries in Europe. So there was another reconfiguration of the colonial system. For example, Southwest Africa had been controlled by the Germans
Yeah.
prior to 1915. And then the British took over after that. And it became a subcolony of the British through the Union of South Africa. And that went on all the way up to 1948. So then, of course, there was resistance that was continuing. In the mining industry, there was the development of the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, which was largely based in the mining industry. And they fought tremendously, had strikes. The ICU had strikes during even the 1920s. You also had the formation of the Communist Party of South Africa in 1921, which was also involved in the organization of the mining unions during the 1920s.
And
Then the ANC, of course, was still continuing to work and to expand, and they had not become a mass-based organization. That really didn't happen until World War II. So yes, all of this was going on during this particular time period. And also you have resistance going on in the rural areas as well. There's a book by Govan Mbeki, who is the father of Thabo Mbeki. Govan Mbeki was a
ah,
intellectual historian. He wrote a book called The Peasants' Revolt. Came out during the 1960s, but he actually chronicles all of these revolts and rebellions that took place largely in the rural areas among the peasantry against the confiscation of land and the demand for cheap labor. So this brings us up to the period of World War II, where you had this split within the world imperialist system. Uh, Germany and Italy, of course, adopted a fascist system after their economies largely collapsed in the aftermath of World War One. And during that time period, you had Boers within South Africa who actually sided with the Nazis against the British. So that created a problem. Some of the Boer nationalist leaders were arrested and spent time in prison during World War II. Nonetheless, the fascists were defeated in 1945. And after that period, there was another election that was held in 1948 in which the Nationalist Party, the Boer Party, prevailed. And after that, they established the apartheid system and created even more laws to further oppress the African people.
uh, talk about some of the conditions and some of the Jim Crow like laws again on steroids, and some of the other settler colonial racial capitalist laws on steroids, and just and then describe what the average Afrikaner who's not even, middle class, who's not even rich, or the Anglo Afrikaner who's not, a comfortable middle class person or even a super rich person, those working class people, but they really did live a life of of comfort. There's no other word I can find comfort compared to the vast majority of the indigenous Black African people, some South Asians as well, and colored people, but talk about but yeah, compare and contrast that for us because I really want people to know just how hideous the system of apartheid South Africa was.
Yes, the Boers were heavily into farming, the control of land, the control of livestock, and the production of agricultural goods. That was a major source of their livelihood. So they controlled a considerable amount of land. This came out of the Union of South Africa Treaty. They created the Union of South Africa around 1910. So they did live better by and large than the African people whose land had been stolen, whose wealth had been confiscated, and who were subjected to forced cheap labor, almost like slave labor. The salaries were extremely low, and in the mines and in other areas of production, the mortality rates were extremely high. So the management within the mining sectors was dominated by whites, and Africans, by and large, were at the bottom rung of the mining industry. And also in the farming communities as well, because you had Africans who were hired by Boer farmers to do their work for them at almost non-existent wages. And they were subjected to harassment. A set of laws were created, vagrancy laws, and other statutes which control the movement of African people, control where they could live, and even the type of work that they were involved in.
Uh, that's okay. That's fascinating in and of itself. Were a lot of the white Afrikaners of a British background were they mostly in the mining industry, whereas the Afrikaner Dutch it's a for it's a form of Dutch. It's not classical Dutch like what my father speaks. That's hence why they call it
Yeah,
Afrikaans. Were those white South Africans mostly then the farming uh, uh, in the farming industry? Boers means farmer actually, so so it's so that's interesting in and of itself.
yeah, it is. And the fact that the South African company, which was formed by Cecil Rhodes, and later the Anglo-American Corporation and De Beers, were largely British controlled mining corporations. So they had the dominance in regard to the mining industry, which made a tremendous amount of money, not only for the British, but for the entire world capitalist system. So yes, that they were dominant. They had more money. They controlled the mines, and this created a lot of resentment on the part of the Boers as well, with them forming their own political party, which became dominant in the 1948 after the 1948 elections.
So we're
But prior to that, there was the shifting of tactics on the part of the African National Congress. In 1943, there was a formation of the ANC Youth League. And there was also the development of a program of action, which is largely attributed to the ANC Youth League. And they began to advocate and agitate more forcefully through general strikes and mass demonstrations demanding land and the right to vote within the Union of South Africa.
and most and then at the same time, I mean, there was what I guess what you call workers' rights and stuff like that amongst white people,
Yes, they had
but
separate white unions. They did form their own separate unions, even as early as the 1920s. And this was a major issue because they did not want to unite with the African workers. They wanted to have a higher status, and that would create serious problems in terms of any type of unity between the 1920s all the way up, really, until the 1980s, and even after that, you have, even today, there's still unions, like, for example, a union called Solidarity, for example, is still heavily white dominated. So,
Wow.
the racism even went over into the labor organizing, which is what happened here in the United States as well, because some of the early unions would not even organize African Americans, like the Knights of Labor, later the American Federation of Labor. Even in the farming sector, there was a national farmers union going all the way back to the 1880s, which they would not allow Black people to become involved with. So the Black people formed their own colored farmers national union and drafted their own constitution and so forth. And these documents have been retrieved in recent periods. So it's a similar situation in South Africa as well. You had the ICU, the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, and for example, after World War II in 1946, there was a huge Rand miners' strike that took place, which people in the United States supported. People like, for example, the Council on African Affairs, formed by people like Paul Robeson and uh, Alpheus Hunton and W.B. Du Bois were all involved in the Council on African Affairs. In 1946, during the Rand miners' strike, they had a huge rally of probably 20,000 people at Madison Square Garden to raise money and material aid for the African workers during the Rand miners' strike. So, in terms of the ANC, they had ties with African Americans going all the way back to the early part of the 20th century, and people like Pixie Sime, who even traveled to the United States and studied, was influenced by developments taking place here as well. So there's been this connection between the progressive forces in South Africa and the African American struggle in the United States.
And interestingly enough, it was Communist Party USA and the social anarchists, the anarchist Wobblies, were one of the few largely white spaces in which Black people and other people of color were in a safe space, unlike a lot of the other unions. And that even includes the Socialist Party, and that even includes the largely white farmer populist party.
Yes, the Populist Party
That's interesting.
in the 1880s. Yeah, there were contradictions within that as well. There were African Americans who were part of it, but eventually the leadership became extremely racist. So, yeah, it's a very complex and contradictory period. You're talking about the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And you're right, the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies, did say that they will organize all workers, irrespective of color. And in the US, there were efforts on the part of the communists to form their own unions. Came out of the 1919 steelworkers strike, which sought to organize people of all races, but they were largely defeated. And it wasn't until after the general strikes of 1934 that the Committee on Industrial Organizations was founded. And they pledged initially to organize all workers, irrespective of color. Now, after the Cold War, that began to shift when the left forces were driven out, and they had to adhere to loyalty oaths and other forms of censorship during the late 1940s and during the 1950s. So,
Yes.
yes, but in the Rand miners' strike is a good example of 1946. And then, of course, in 1950, you had the Suppression of Communism Act, which banned the Communist Party of South Africa. They had to go completely underground. They did resurface as the Communist Party of, they resurfaced as the South African Communist Party, but they were still largely underground up until 1990.
Yes, I have to ask this question. I can't believe I didn't type up this question. Okay, so South Africa is a white supremacist, explicitly white supremacist state, but there are multiple white supremacist parties. So I'm very curious. Going back to the distinct community that is the Dutch Boer community and the Anglo white South African community. Uh, did some of these white supremacist parties were some more aligned with Boer interests and farmer interests, and others more aligned with mining interests and British dominated mining interests?
Yeah, and yes, they were more, the Boer parties were more concerned about their own, what they perceived to be national interests. That's why they call it the Nationalist Party that became dominant in 1948. The British had separate parties. The Liberal Party was one of them, and they were mainly concerned about British interests within South Africa. But they did realize that there had to be some reforms, particularly after World War II. And the French reached the same conclusion. We talked about the founding of the Republic, the Fourth Republic, in 1944 under de
Yeah.
Gaulle. And they even had a summit conference in Brazzaville, which is today the Republic of Congo, in 1944. We talked about this several months ago. But yes, the Suppression of Communism Act of 1950, you had a escalation of the racial separation. In 1952, you had the imposition of the pass laws. And of course, there was also the emergence of the Campaign of Defiance against unjust laws, which brought together several anti-apartheid organizations from the various population groups starting around 1952. But the Communist Party had already been organizing during that particular time period. Nelson Mandela and other ANC leaders had met with them. Some of them joined the Communist Party and others did not. But they did have alliances with them as early as the late 1940s and early 1950s. Now, the Defiance Campaign of 1952 was a nonviolent campaign involving marches and other forms of civil disobedience. This went on for approximately 4 years. In 1956, there was a huge women's march against the pass laws, and 20,000 women marched on Pretoria to present petitions to the government at that time, the racist apartheid government at that time. And in response to the campaign of defiance against unjust laws, you had the indictment of approximately 156 activists charged with treason. This trial went on for 4 years. So the alliance consisted of the African National Congress, the Colored People's Organization. It also involved the Congress of Democrats, which was largely a white organization that was heavily influenced by the communists, and also the Indian National Congress. So these 4 groups were the principal leaders of the defiance campaign against unjust laws. There was also the South African Congress of Trade Unions, SACTU, which preceded today's Congress of South African Trade Unions. So these groups were eventually banned in 1960, but this trial went on from 1956 to 1960, and they were acquitted, even in the South African courts. So the movement continued, and of course, in 1960, there was this massacre at Sharpeville of people who were protesting against the pass law. But to go back a year earlier, in 1958, 1959, there was a split within the African National Congress. Another group surfaced calling themselves the Pan-Africanist Congress.
Yeah.
Eventually, the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, headed by a man named Robert Sobukwe. And ideologically, they disagreed with the non-racial politics of the African National Congress. So at this time, you had 2 major liberation movements. um, which encompassed various mass organizations. In 1955, prior to the treason trials, there was the Congress of the People at Kliptown in South Africa, where they drafted what was known as the Freedom Charter. People can go read the Freedom Charter. It's up online today, and that outlined what the ANC and its allies considered their program of action in regard to the effort to defeat the apartheid system.
And like the U.S. South, but even parts of the U.S. North, and even parts of Canada, people don't know that in Canada also there was racial segregation laws. There were all these sorts of laws. Black people had to drink at this water fountain, and the white people have this water fountain. But even more extreme than that of black people going into separate schools, white people going into separate schools, and not being allowed to intermingle in restaurants, in whatever concerts, public transportation. But it was more extreme in South Africa because the U.S., the Supreme Court, when they allowed racial segregation, they they said that schools, whatever facilities, they at least have to be fair and equal. But yes, we can. But yes, you can. The niggers can stay over there, and the whites can stay there. Whereas in South Africa, no such a concept of that. It really was the whites. We are the chosen people of God, and all of these other people are nothing more than slaves to us. And I'm pretty sure a lot of those Dutch Reformed churches found all sorts of passages in the Bible that justified slavery, the curse of Ham, which is apparently why so many white Christians really don't like black people and stuff like that, and even brown people that also engage in anti-black racism. so so there was that so there was that extremity where you would go to very small communities of white people living again very comfortable lives, very nice gated community lives. It's as almost as if you were going to a Hollywood community of of the film industry, whereas any part of again majority black people, the poverty was just uh, unspeakable, just very unspeakable how extreme the poverty was. Do you want to talk about that before we talk about Nelson Mandela and the resistance against South Africa? Well,
Yes,
apartheid.
just like in the United States, in 1873 there was the slaughterhouse case, which in many ways upended the purpose and meaning of the 14th Amendment. In essence, it said that the capitalists also had a right to due process along with the formerly enslaved. Then in 1883, 10 years later, there was a bundle of civil rights cases in which the Supreme Court largely overturned and said they had no authority to enforce any type of equal opportunity or equal treatment among the races. And then in 1896, there was the Plessy versus Ferguson case in which they said separate but equal is not unconstitutional. Now, they remembered the separate part, but they forgot about completely the equal part. So it was a similar situation in Africa as well. And in South Africa, as you mentioned, the situation was dire among the African people. And even among the mixed race community, the colored people were also discriminated against, even though they tried to make it appear to pass off this idea that they were somehow superior to the indigenous African people or African people who did not have any identifiable European ancestry. And
Is that people from the colored community themselves that thought that they were superior?
well, they were taught
Just
that. They were taught that. They were
okay,
taught
okay,
that
okay,
by
okay.
the whites, but in reality, it did not exist, and a lot of them
And
did resist.
is that same with the South Asians, like and the
Yes,
Indian? Because okay, talk. Yeah,
same situation. They were separated. They were told that they were superior to the Africans. and the colored people, but in reality, they really weren't. Now, there were some South Asians who did accumulate wealth, uh, particularly in East Africa. In Uganda and Kenya, you had a strata of East Asians that engaged in commercial work and agricultural production. But in essence, they were not free at all either. So this hierarchy of oppression and social control was created, and it was institutionalized in South Africa. And the reason why, just like in the United States, you look at the states where slavery existed during the antebellum period. In many counties and regions in those states, Africans constituted majorities or near majorities. A state like South Carolina, for example, at one point during the antebellum period, Africans outnumbered Europeans. So they had to have strict racial segregation laws. South Africa was even more pronounced. You had Africans outnumbering whites by huge margins. So in order to maintain the system, they had to have a minority rule construct that was established. So the laws just provided the rationale for the maintenance of the system.
Darkly fascinating. Now that's a perfect segue then to this question. So explain to us why Nelson Mandela was jailed and how the CIA helped his capture. Then explain to us how, contrary to popular historical memory that depicts the fall of apartheid largely as a non-violent BDS movement domestically as well as internationally, but there was, as you said last week and the week before, there was an armed struggle armed struggle and sabotage within South Africa. South Africa's neighbors also engaged in the exact same thing, and South Africa, under the apartheid regime, was involved in multiple proxy wars for Western imperialism: the U.S., Canada, Australia, New Zealand, West Germany, France, much of what we call the EU and NATO all supported South Africa, and South Africa was very much used as a proxy for Western imperialism, particularly in Africa. Israel also was an ally to apartheid South Africa, and helped along with some other countries. I'm forgetting apartheid South Africa making nuclear weapons. So all that being said, so I want you to talk about that, but also talk about the following: that it was the USSR, what's now present day the Russian Federation, and the island nation of Cuba that helped defeat and vanquish at least social racial apartheid in the end.
Most definitely. And in 1960, there was the banning of both the African National Congress as well as the Pan-Africanist Congress after the Sharpeville massacre, which took place on March 21st. So the leadership of these groups were forced underground. And as a result of that, they continued to resist. They continued to have stayaways and strikes, but it was very, very dangerous to do so. So in 1961, they realized that they could not continue utilizing civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance. Their people were being slaughtered. We talked about this earlier in regard to the former Portuguese colonies and also Southern Rhodesia as well. So in December of 1961, the Spear of the Nation was formed, Umkhonto we Sizwe, which involved the members of the Communist Party and the African National Congress that set up Umkhonto we Sizwe. Now, by this time, Nelson Mandela was a member of the Communist Party, but it was largely kept secret all the way until the time of his death, interestingly enough. But, many people knew that even prior to his passing, but he died in 2013. But yeah, they started an armed struggle, and Mandela was sent uh, outside the country to get military training. He went to Ethiopia, where he received military training from the military forces associated with the monarchy of Haile Selassie. Then he went
Okay.
to Morocco to train with the FLN, the National Liberation Front of Algeria. Spent months over there. All right. And he also spent time in what's known as Tanganyika at that time, which later became Tanzania. So, yes, he spent time there doing military training. And then underground, he went back into South Africa during 1962. And this is where he was captured in
Yes. Okay.
1962. And it was the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency that was able to track him, provided that information to the racist apartheid settler colonial government. And he was pulled over in 1962 and arrested. All right. Later, in 1963, there was a raid on the Rivonia farm, which was really the headquarters of Umkhonto we Sizwe and the entire resistance during that time period. So in 64, you had the Rivonia trial, where a number of ANC and Communist Party and Umkhonto we Sizwe cadres and leaders were put on trial and found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. A lot of people thought they may be executed. Now, there were 3 people that were executed during that time period, but Mandela and the others, Walter Sisulu and others, Govan and Becky, were spared their lives. And
But were they guilty of trying to plan of trying to plan terrorist attacks against the apartheid state? Is there no shadow of a doubt that they definitely were planning?
of
Uh,
course,
okay, okay.
there were attacks as early as 1961, largely sabotage attacks, the bombing of pylons, bombing of government offices, and so forth. This took place between late 1961, all the way up until the raid on the headquarters in 1963. Clearly, yeah, they were out to overthrow the government, or at least weaken the government to the point where they'd have to, the apartheid system would have to collapse. Yes.
I asked that question because, again, in popular history, especially the history that loves to lionize and deify Nelson Mandela, it's that he was imprisoned wrongly for trying to do a terrorist attack, that he was all about nonviolence, like Martin Luther King Jr., like Gandhi before him, and so forth. And yeah, and again, that's how it's taught in popular media and in popular history and so forth. I was always taught, okay, yeah, he was wrongly imprisoned for 27 years along with his other people. And again, like armed struggle, that gets completely suppressed. There's no other word.
Exactly.
It really gets suppressed. So that's why I want you to talk a bit more about that, and just in general talk about how yes, when it came to solidarity, people in North America, Europe, and so forth all engaged in nonviolent BDS, did demonstrations where the police would often beat them up anyways, but that in South Africa itself and the neighboring states, oh, there was lots of armed rebellion, and that's why South Africa did was a Western imperialist proxy for wars in Angola, Mozambique, even Botswana, and so forth.
Yes, he was wrongly convicted for fighting to liberate his people, which he had a right to do. You have an inherent right, to self-determination. And even the UN Human Rights Charter says that all people have certain rights, fundamental, basic human rights. And later, even the UN passed resolutions saying that armed struggle was justified if peaceful means of struggle were impractical or impossible. So yes, he was wrongly convicted, not for taking up arms, not for organizing a military wing of the liberation movement. He was wrongly convicted because he was fighting justly against an unjust system. So they were put away in 1964, and many of them remained locked up. Some were released in the late 1980s, but it wasn't until 1990 that the government, the Nationalist Party government of F.W. de Klerk, on February the 2nd of 1990, lifted the ban on the ANC and released the political prisoners in South Africa. And this was right on the eve of the independence of Namibia, which took place on March 21st of 1990.
And talk to us then about some. Okay, so there was armed struggle, and there was acts of. I don't like the term terrorism being used when it comes to the liberation of apartheid South Africa, but there was acts of sabotage, railroads, and being sabotaged, places where armed shipments which were going to go to slaughter Angolans, people in Botswana, people in Lesotho, people in Swaziland, and all of those places. So there was acts of sabotage against armed shipments and stuff like that, and uh, yeah. So talk to us about that. And did South Africa itself largely suppress that internationally because they did not want people to be inspired by that? But within South Africa, many whites literally were afraid that holy shit, one of these days is there a possibility that that black people are going to take up arms and you know liberate themselves and we're going to be all slaughtered? I'm very curious your response to that.
Yeah, that fear existed, and today Donald Trump is trying to promote that notion, even though that's not the position of the government of national unity that's headed by the ANC, even the Democratic Alliance, even AfriForum, which is a right-wing Africana-dominated group, put out a statement earlier this week saying that there was no threat and there was no ongoing white genocide in South Africa. So this is a lie that's being promoted by the people who are heading the imperialist system right now, the MAGA Republicans. But yes, there was armed conflict initially in 1967, 68. Mkhonto we Sizwe, along with the Zimbabwe African People's Union, or their military wing, ZIPRA, Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, carried out joint attacks at the Wonky Game Reserve in Rhodesia. Did not succeed, but there were lessons definitely learned from that. And there were consistent underground attacks against government installations and other types of institutions. And after the 1976 uprising on the part of the students and the workers, many of the people went into exile. Large numbers of people went into exile.
And that's the Soweto uprising, not the show.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, labeled as the Soweto uprising, where the students had protested against the imposition of Afrikaans only educational training in the African segregated and inferior schools. And they were met with brutal, absolutely brutal, deadly repression. So a lot of them fled the country and went and got military training in ANC camps and PAC camps, and then they returned. Solomon Mhlongo, for example, one of the early people from the so-called Soweto generation who went back into the country and was killed in a military operation. He's lionized, was lionized during the liberation struggle, and still remains a heroic figure in South African resistance history. And then in 1980, there was the bombing of the Sasol coal to petroleum conversion plant. That was a major military operation that took place around mid 1980. And then there were others. in 1983, the bombing of the South African Air Force headquarters in Pretoria. It killed a lot of people. It was carried out by Mkhonto Wesizwe. So yes, there were violent armed attacks on the part of the liberation movements against the South African military and also commercial institutions. There were the planning of lipid mines on the border between Mozambique and South Africa, targeting white-dominated farming communities. And they
Wow.
also trained, I mentioned earlier, they trained in Angola, also in Ethiopia, as well as in the Kingdom of Lesotho, where Chris Hani was based between 1974 and 1982.
And that's extraordinary. Never, I was never taught any of that. And
No, they distort. Even the civil rights movement in this country has been heavily distorted. I mean, people like Robert Williams, for example, in Monroe, North Carolina, through the NAACP, they set up self-defense groups to fight the Klan. The Deacons for Defense in 1964 in Louisiana set up armed groups to fight the Ku Klux Klan in that area. Even though the dominant theoretical position advocated by SCLC and even the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and CORE up until a certain period was nonviolent resistance, but it wasn't limited to that. And even Dr. King's position, for example, against the Vietnam War,
uh-huh.
he came out on April 4th, well, at Riverside Church, but even months before that, he had taken a position against the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Oftentimes, that's completely overlooked in any history of the civil rights movement. There's a film that came out the year after he was assassinated called From Montgomery to Memphis. And in that film, they edit out the King's anti-war work in 1967 and in 1968. So it's a complete distortion of what actually took place. They didn't mention that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had come out against the U.S. war in Vietnam, as well as against the draft in January of 1966. And even prior to that, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which was set up heavily by SNCC and CORE, that challenged the Democratic National Committee and the seating of the all-white Mississippi Democratic Party delegation in 1964 in Atlantic City, had made statements in 1965 against the war. But all of that is overlooked, and even today, you have even putative civil rights groups that ignore the work of SCLC and SNCC against war and against imperialism. So it's up to progressive forces to raise these issues and not allow this history to be distorted. But it's the same situation in South Africa. The people did involve themselves in armed struggle, but it was a combination of mass struggle, class struggle through the trade union movement, and armed struggle, which created the crisis in South Africa that came to a head really during the mid 1980s.
Well, that's a perfect segue for me to ask you to expand more on, Canada loves to pat itself on the back, wrongly, that they were always against apartheid South Africa, and both Pierre Trudeau and Brian Mulroney were the best friends to Nelson Mandela when he was in jail. Complete bullshit, but I don't want to get into that. I do want to get into the following, though. The Soviet Union, now present-day Russian Federation, and Cuba, still communist Cuba, how they were on the front line, not only diplomatically at the UN and different international summits, but actually supported the armed struggle against South Africa, and when South Africa was a proxy, and then to pan-European imperialism in the continent of Africa. Please talk about that.
Yeah, also the People's Republic of China, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the Socialist Federation of Yugoslavia. They were all involved in supporting the liberation movements in South Africa. And the China, for example, although it was complicated by the Sino-Soviet split
Yeah.
of the period of the late 50s to the early and even 1960s, eventually the ANC was supported by China, and that's confirmed in an interview, I believe in 1983, by Oliver Tambo, who was the then acting president of the African National Congress. So yes, and also the DPRK provided support to the ANC as well as SWAPO during that particular time period.
Wow.
So yes, they were all involved, and that is the reality. That is the actual history of the situation inside the country. Yeah.
Yeah, and Eve Engler said that actually it was the Eastern European communist blocs that were actually way better than France, Canada towards the ends,
Mhm.
and other Western countries that had to be dragged kicking and screaming to do some forms
Yes.
of BDS. So that's
Yeah,
just
the German Democratic Republic was a key ally of the ANC and SWAPO. Yes. So yeah, all the countries, the so-called Comecon countries, the former Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the DPRK, Yugoslavia, the People's Republic of China, and the Republic of Cuba were always heavily involved in supporting the liberation movements on the continent, whether
yes.
it's through mass struggle, nonviolent resistance, or armed struggle.
In both Botswana and in South Africa, there's also a memorial to the many countless Cuban soldiers that lost their lives in the liberation of both nations, as well as
Yes,
Angola and whatnot. So, uh,
right. And all these countries, the
yes,
so-called frontline states, they were attacked and they suffered immensely during the anti-apartheid revolutionary struggle. Um, we talked about Lesotho last week, the invasions that took place there in 1982, again in 1985, that people lost their lives, South Africans as well as Lesotho nationals. They bombed Botswana, Mozambique, as well as Zimbabwe, and attacks on Angola as well. So, yes, those countries suffered immensely as a result of the struggle to end the racist apartheid system in South Africa, as well as Namibia, and also the total liberation of Angola.
fascinating. Briefly, talk to us about both the colored community in South Africa and the indigenous San people, those who do live within the borders of present-day South Africa, and the unique cruelty and crimes against humanity the apartheid government inflicted on them as well. Learning about the plight of the San people in present day and how they fared under apartheid rule. For anyone who has seen the two films, The Gods Must Be Crazy 1 and 2, it actually makes for very disturbing research. And I think for many people, when they actually do research into the indigenous San people and how South Africa was, denigrating the Cuban, the Cuban help and others. Anyways, it makes The Gods Must Be Crazy 1 and 2, which was just a South African propaganda film, very disturbing, and I will never be able to actually watch both of those two films again, even though they are good comedies and there's some good music and there is some anti-capitalist message, but it's propaganda and the kind of
It is.
gaslighting that Hollywood and British films are notorious for.
Yeah, those films came out during the mid to late 1980s when the struggle had reached a fever pitch in South Africa and Namibia, as well as in Angola, throughout the entire region. Africa progressive forces and even the moderate forces were all mobilized to support the total liberation of the African continent. And that went on internationally as well. Even in the Nordic countries, there were huge amounts of support for the abolition of apartheid. And even in the United States, we talked about it earlier, where there was this connection between people from South Africa, particularly the African National Congress and progressive forces inside the United States, going all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century and extending all the way up until the 1980s and 1990s. So yes, that movie, those films, and films of that nature were put out specifically to undermine the image and the work of both people inside the region as well as internationally, to turn it into a joke, to make it look like the African people had no basis for independent existence and self-determination and self-rule. And the San, the Khoisan people, some of them were able to integrate into other chieftaincies and nations in the region, but many of them were wiped out because they were denigrated as cattle raiders, and that provided a rationale for their extermination, that they were a danger or that they were a menace to white societies. And of course, some of their women were raped by the Boers and the British, prompting offspring that were labeled coloreds or people within the mixed race community. So yes, that films like that did come out during the 1980s, but they did not have the result, the desired result that the imperialists wanted them to have, and that is to undermine the struggle inside the country.
Well, what's quite shocking about the gods must be crazy when you start to do research into the crazy shit behind the scenes is the following. So while the film celebrates indigenous culture, indigenous San culture, and so forth, uh, first of all, the two productions lied about where they were filming. They claimed they were filming in Botswana. They claimed they were filming in Swaziland. They claimed they were filming in Lesotho, when they really were actually filming in South Africa itself, violating the boycott, divestment,
Exactly,
and so forth. And
and
then
which was a big deal. Yeah.
and then to add even more insult to the injury. So while this film is sort of celebrating, indigenous culture and the San people, that same South African government, apartheid South African government, was snatching San people, forcing them to go into the South African army to kill and murder other South Africans and those who were
Mm-hmm.
part of the armed struggle within South Africa's borders and without. And then so there's all sorts of crazy stuff like that, and the fact that the lead actors weren't paid what they were owed and so forth like that, and still went back to living in the makeup shacks, the kind of shanty towns, reservation like conditions that a lot of Australian Aboriginal people and even Native Americans still live under. So again, it makes this film that a lot of us grew up laughing and loving just very disturbing, and I don't think I'll ever be able
Well,
to watch them
you have to
again.
consider like movies like Tarzan and Jungle Jim and Jungle Boy. All these are propaganda films to justify colonialism and settler colonialism in Africa. The cowboys and Indian movies, where the cowboys, the settlers, are the good guys, and the indigenous people are the bad guys. The only good guys among the Indians are the Indians who work with the whites against their own people. So in Zimbabwe, for example, you had a group called the Zella Scouts, who were Africans who were recruited by the Rhodesians to fight against their own people. So they've been doing this for a
Wow.
long time. And in South Africa itself, you had the Inkatha Freedom Movement. That's what they call themselves, headed by Gasha Buthelezi. And they were a paramilitary group that principally fought against the ANC and their armed wings. And they did a lot of damage particularly during the 70s and the 1980s, even in the early 1990s, after the political prisoners were released. The Nationalist Party, even though they claimed that they were committed to negotiate a settlement of ending apartheid, they were still funding these anti-revolutionary groups. When I was there in 1992, this was during the transition period. People were being killed every day by these Inkatha people who were being paid directly by the apartheid system. In places like Alexandria, for example, one of the South African cities for Africans, there were areas you couldn't even go into, if you were not a part of their organization. They'd kill you.
Wow.
Yeah, so they fueled this type of division. Uh, and it even intensified during the struggles from like 1985 to 1990. It even got worse after 1990. And you see remnants of that today with this Afrophobic movement that's going on in South Africa now, the Dudula movement. I'm almost certain, I haven't had time to really research it, but these people are funded, by right-wing elements and could even be funded by conservative and reactionary think tanks and even intelligence agencies outside of South Africa, perhaps in the United States or Britain. Because if they can keep this type of confusion going, this hampers the capacity of any type of cohesiveness in South Africa and also development that benefits the African people.
There's I don't have the name of the museum, but there is if I ever go to South Africa, I'm going to this place to visit this museum. But apparently, there's a very good museum about the plight of the San people, their history during South Africa, and their calls for radical decolonial justice and so forth. I'll make sure to put the link to that, and yeah, quite fascinating. So so all that being said, that's a perfect segue to this question, which is, what was the idea of Bantustans in apartheid South Africa as a way to fix, quote unquote, the colored problem?
Yes. Well, this was another tactic that was used to break up the cohesiveness of the African people, to undermine the liberation movements. In the mid-60s, they created places like, for example, the Transkei, Ciskei. These were supposed to be homelands based on tribal affiliation that would give Africans some form of self-determination. But it was really a reinforcement of the apartheid system. Venda was one, and Bophuthatswana was another one that surfaced during the early 1980s. And they created this resort area called Sun City, which became a focus on the part of the anti-apartheid movement in this country, because in 1985, the United Artists Against Apartheid put out a record called "I'm Not Going to Play Sun City." And it was a big hit. I think it broke down, to a certain extent, the racial barriers in MTV, when it first started up.
Yeah.
In the mid 1980s, it was criticized for being too white dominated. But when I Ain't Gonna Play Sun City was released, it was gained a lot of traction through MTV. We're talking about 40 years ago. So yes, but there were movements that developed inside those areas in the Transkei and Ciskei, in Venda, as well as Bophuthatswana. So yes.
But Bantustans is just another place that the apartheid says, okay, here, you poor African workers, here's a small piece of land. You guys can self-govern, but you still have to live
under your labor. We still want your labor. They wanted their labor. They wanted their resources, okay. And they have veto power over, whatever, those people in Transkei and Ciskei and Bophuthatswana and the others decided to do. But all that broke down beginning in the late 1980s and early 1990s, to the point where the masses rejected that. And one of the last holdouts was in 1994, when the purported government of Bophuthatswana told the people that they would not be able to participate in the non-racial elections. These are the first non-racial elections in the history of the country. And they were told that they would not be able to participate. And the police in that homeland, purported homeland or Bantustan, overthrew the government. You know, Mugabe, that was his name, overthrew him and took over the Bantustan government. And then these outlaw Boer militia groups tried to go in and reestablish control of the Bantustan leaders, and they were beat terribly.
Wow.
This is
Wow.
1994. So the contradictions were quite interesting. And then even the Inkatha Freedom Party, which it became known, had to accept the outcome of the elections of 1994, where the ANC won like 62% of the votes, and there was some process that was worked out, and it did a lot to end that conflict that had been raging for perhaps 8 years
Wow.
between Inkatha and the supporters of the United Democratic Front, which was formed in 1983. And that organization they considered themselves charterists. They were pretty much a front for the African National Congress. They couldn't say that openly, but a lot of the ANC veterans came out of their banning and became leaders of the United Democratic Front. But a lot of those people were killed as well by the apartheid system and also by these reactionaries who were being paid by the apartheid system.
A perfect segue then to talk about this person. Although we have to be, let's be brief about him
Okay.
because we still have so much to get through. Talk to us about Steve Biko and his legacy, and what about his teachings and advocacy do you find gets criminally overlooked in popular history regarding him? Because he's another person who's often just depicted, even in uh, British left-leaning television, like World in Action or Thames TV, when they did reports on South Africa. They're interviewing Steve Biko himself, but again, you would think that anyways, you would think that he's just an advocate of nonviolence and is just a black and proud type of man. So I'm very curious your response to that.
Well, after the banning of the ANC and the PAC and the Communist Party, people didn't stop fighting. These groups were still functioning underground. And then in the late 60s, there was the formation of the SASO, the South African Students Organization, which Biko came out of. And eventually there was the Black People's Convention. I believe that was in 1972. And out of that came what was known as the Black Consciousness Movement. And Biko became a extremely articulate spokesperson for the Black Consciousness Movement. And he was arrested during the post-1976 rebellions. He was detained and he was murdered by the apartheid regime in 1977, September of 1977. And they claim, he was killed himself or whatever, or hit his head on a concrete or whatever, because he was, blind with fury. And, but it was all a lie. And he was buried in it. That didn't end the struggle. A lot of the Black consciousness groups were also banned in 1977. So they had banned the liberation movements. Well, the Communist Party was banned as early as 1950. The ANC and the PAC was banned in 1960. The South African Congress of Trade Unions was also banned in earlier years. So you had the rise of the Black consciousness movement, and then they banned that as well. So they wanted no organization in existence that was fighting on behalf of the oppressed people. And eventually the United Democratic Front was banned after 1986. It was a state of emergency declared, and they were banned. And then a mass democratic movement surfaced during the late 1980s and early 1990s. But in 1990, the UDF was unbanned.
And
And
what
of course,
about what about Steve Biko? Do you find gets criminally overlooked since so much of popular history, especially in movies like Cry. It's not Cry Freedom Town. Wait, I think it's Cry Freedom
Mhm.
Town. Well,
Mm.
it's the movie with Denzel Washington. Denzel Washington plays Steve Biko, and
Okay.
in that movie they really do just depict him as just a non-violent struggle guy, and the white journalist who becomes his ally.
Yeah, I remember.
He's depicted as, oh, okay, I completely distorted some of your calls to action, so forth. So was Steve Biko an advocate of Franz Fanon type of politics in which he did believe in armed struggle, and was a radical decolonialist, and yeah, your response.
Yeah, he was heavily influenced by Frantz Fanon in the same way that the Black liberation movement in the United States was influenced by Frantz Fanon. So you had the Black Power movement, which was an influence on the Black consciousness movement, as well as the writings of Frantz Fanon. He could not come out in the 70s openly in favor of armed struggle. But at the same time, both liberation movements claim him. The Pan Africanist Congress of Azania claim him, and the ANC says they were in negotiations, in discussions with Steve Biko, in terms of collaborating with him. I've heard Thabo and Becky talk about, they were setting up a meeting with him. So, they both claim him, but he
Interesting.
was an important figure. Yeah.
We're going to get into this soon. It's kind of very sad and ironic that his widow girlfriend, she works for mining companies and for fake UN organizations that don't help us.
Yeah, the medical doctor. Yeah, she at one point, luckily enough, she backed out. She was going to hook up with the DA, the Democratic Alliance, and some
Oh
type of
my god!
electoral report came. This was years ago, but it was over in a few days. She left in a few days, but yes.
So that's a perfect segue to then talk about this, which is talk to us about the often criminally overlooked legacy and epic contributions. You've actually been talking about them quite a lot in this interview, and that is the South African Communist Party in resisting apartheid. Talk to us also about Chris Hani and his murder, and the late, and I'm going to be butchering his last name, but the late Chris Malthako, or
Okay. This he was who?
So talk to us about the often overlooked legacy of the South African Communist Party in resisting
Yeah.
apartheid, then Chris Hani and his murder, and the late Chris Malthuku, who I believe passed away a few years ago.
Okay. Well, of course, the South African Communist Party was there. Um, they were in alliance with the ANC. They were part of MK, Mkhonto we Sizwe. Some were arrested and put in prison. Some were killed by the apartheid system, outright killed. Some died under very mysterious circumstances. Chris Hani was a member of both the ANC and the Communist Party. In fact, it was mandated, I believe, after 1969, that every member of the South African Communist Party also had to be a member of the ANC. So
Okay, interesting.
they subordinated their objectives to the national liberation struggle. Uh, that's starting to break down now with the upcoming elections, local government elections, where the SACP is running, saying that they're going to run their own candidates. But yeah, that's what happened. So yeah, all these groups were working closely together. Now, of course, there was a split between the ANC and the PAC, which caused a lot of consternation. But no, the SACP and the ANC work very closely together.
Was it largely black people, colored people, South Asian people, or were there also quite a lot of white people in the South African Communist Party? I'm very curious.
Yeah, when it started out, it was heavily white. But as the time went on, in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, 50s, Africans became a majority, and they had African general secretaries. Moses Kotane is one of them. Uh, Moses Mabia was another one who was prominent during the 1980s, and then eventually Chris Hani, who became Secretary General of the SACP. Joe Slovo, who was a Lithuanian Jewish ancestry, was heavily involved in both the South African Communist Party and the ANC. So yes, they were, and
That's
Indians as well were heavily involved in the progressive Indians were heavily involved in the South African Communist Party, the ANC, and Umkhonto Wesizwe.
uh talk a bit more about Chris Hani and who murdered him and why was he murdered. And apparently he was already starting to disapprove of what later became the historical compromises when apartheid was supposedly abolished. So, talk to us about that.
Yeah, he returned to the country and jumped immediately into the struggle during the period of negotiations. And he was doing a lot of political work. Now, on August 9th, I believe it was 1990, they signed what was known as the Pretoria Minute, which theoretically suspended the armed struggle in South Africa. Yet, violence continued at a devastating rate between 1990 and 1994. So Chris Hani was assassinated in 1993 in Boksburg, I believe, where his home was located. He was out jogging one morning and he was shot to death by a Polish immigrant um, who is now out of prison. But yes, he was shot down, brutally executed. And this was done on the part of the apartheid system in order to undermine the negotiations for the transition to a non-racial democratic system in the first instance. There was unrest that erupted immediately inside the country. So the ANC leadership had to redirect this anger to stay focused on the negotiation process. And the elections were held a year after he was assassinated. But the Clive Derby, I believe was his name, and another gentleman were convicted in his murder. So, and they served decades in prison.
And there's another thing about Chris Hani I wanted to ask about, but I'll ask a bit later. Briefly, if it's possible, then talk to us about the late Chris Malthako. I'm probably not pronouncing his name correctly. Who was a member of the South African Communist Party who passed away, and the International
Oh,
Manifesto. And the International Manifesto Group did a celebration of his life and legacy. And both you and Margaret Kimberly, the executive editor of Black Agenda Report, spoke at this online event.
yeah, Chris Mklako. Yeah, he was popularly known as Shay. They gave him that nickname. But yeah, he was dealing a lot with international relations between the South African Communist Party and other organizations and coalitions internationally. Yeah, I
And,
was on a panel with him at one point as well, a
and
webinar.
anything about his legacy that you want our audience
Well, he did a lot of work to consolidate alliances between the SACP and other left groups internationally. He had been a member of the Congress of South African Students, COSAS, which was formed, I believe, around 1985. This was a pro-ANC, pro-Communist Party youth group that was largely based in the high schools during that time period. So, yeah.
fantastic. Now, briefly talk to us about the legacy and your assessment of the late Winnie Mandela And then also briefly, any reflections on the legacy of Archbishop Desmond Tutu? Uh, Very curious your response to that before we start talking about post-apartheid South Africa.
Yeah, Winnie Mandela was a major force in the anti-apartheid struggle. She married Mandela during the late 1950s. And after he was arrested and sentenced to life in prison, in many ways, she became the voice of the ANC and the liberation movement. She suffered immensely. Uh, the apartheid system did everything possible to destroy her psychologically, as well as to damage her political influence, uh, creating false allegations, false criminal charges against her in order to undermine the movement. But she was a staunch member of the ANC Women's League and was a staunch participant in MK, Mkhonto we Sizwe, the arm wing of the African National Congress.
So she wasn't a peaceful South African female version of Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi. Is that what you're saying?
No, no, not at all. In many ways, she was more militant than a lot of other ANC leaders. Yeah.
Um, any reflections on the legacy of the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who definitely was a nonviolent fundamentalist?
Yes, he was. And they tried to use him after 1984 by granting him the Nobel Peace Prize to promote him as the leader of the South African movement against apartheid. Now, he rejected that
Okay.
immediately. He said, our leaders are in prison. So they were not able to use him in the way in which they wanted to. So that was pretty interesting. He got the prize in 1984. He continued to speak out. And after 1990, of course, he played a role as well. Now, in later years, he became a critic of ANC policy, but we could talk about that later.
That's a perfect segue. We reached the ends of apartheid in South Africa, but did it really end? I don't even don't know where to begin. I guess just talk to us about what is the socio-economic legacy of Nelson Mandela, and talk to us about the it boils the blood, and when but yeah, talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Yeah, the TRC was set up to try to reconcile the liberation movements, the popular forces, with the former operatives of the racist apartheid regime. Now, some of these people were imprisoned even prior to the development of the TRC, but the whole idea was to prevent or stave off mass prosecutions and incarcerations of those operatives of the repressive system. And a lot of people were called before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Even Winnie Mandela was called to testify before the commission over allegations that she had been involved in the torture and death of a young South African child. His name was Stompie Muketse. But she never spent, after the release of the political prisoner, she never spent any time in prison, even though she was convicted in relationship to that death. It's highly questionable if she was guilty of that at all. And there was also, the TRC also interviewed a lot of the police and military forces as well. And a lot of people were highly critical of it, and some people were quite supportive of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
But basically all of the South Af the apartheid South African government and its deep state basically got away with murder. So they could so they talked about all the crimes against humanity that they did, and then basically, yep, all sins are forgiven. Many people were re-traumatized and had to talk about all the horrific stuff that the apartheid government did, but all sins were literally forgiven, and this is why I have a big problem with Desmond Tutu, the late Desmond Tutu, and as
Mhm.
well as Nelson Mandela. I'm curious your response to that.
Yeah, Tutu was, I believe, the head or the director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Yes, it was kind of bizarre when Winnie Mandela came to testify. I had a copy of the videotape of that, but it's on VHS, so it would have to be converted to an MP4 in order to put it out. But I'm sure it's somewhere online. So that was quite a contradiction. But yes, that's what happened. And a similar situation also happened in Zimbabwe as well. Um, for 5 years, between 1980 and 1985, there was a coalition government between the whites and the majority African population. And then after 1985, Zimbabwe became a republic. So the whites were dismissed from the government. In South Africa, the government of national unity lasted from May of 1994 up until around the fall of 1995, when the Nationalist Party and de Klerk left the government entirely. Today, we have another government of national unity, although the ANC has the majority support in terms of electoral uh, structures, but they fell below 50% and had no choice except to set up a coalition government in 2024 with the Democratic Alliance. And then there were 8 other parties that joined, including the Pan Africanist Congress and many other parties, very small parties that also joined, the Good Party and all those, which are largely fragmented. But some didn't join, like the MK, for example, which is headed by Jacob Zuma, which is a split from the ANC,
Ah,
and the
okay.
Economic Freedom Fighters, which is also a split from the ANC. They did not join the government of national unity. So we'll see what happens after the local government elections and also the next national elections, which will take place, I believe, in 2029.
What's then, in your opinion, what's the socio-economic legacy of Nelson Mandela and then later Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma, all under the ANC, where the Freedom Charter, which was a great socialist, I mean, it's the constitution, literally, of the ANC, a great, socialist, document, but, well, uh, explain what happens.
Yeah, well, there was what they describe as a democratic breakthrough in late April 1994. The taking over of the government by the ANC and the Nationalist Party as a junior partner, the inauguration of Mandela in early May of 1994. There was clearly a compromise. There was no real nationalization of industry, no serious land reform. There was some land reform that has taken place. And there's been the Black economic empowerment policy, where it's somewhat of an affirmative action operation, where Africans were brought into various aspects of the industrial base of South Africa. Even the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, had been involved in the mining industry. So yes, it is controversial. Uh, there was, on the positive side, there was the construction of many homes inside the country, the providing of running water resources, the opening of the universities, even though there's no real free educational program. There's some improvement in that regard. But yes, there were some reforms, but overall, a revolutionary transformation inside the country has still not taken place. We're talking about 32 years after the fall of apartheid.
And South Africa is currently there was also factional ego fights between Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma. Lots of corruption and just bizarre behaviors in, I believe, Zuma's personal life, which plagues both governments. But essentially, as John Pilger often argued up until his death, he said that while social racial apartheid was gone, economic apartheid, central to that grotesque system, remains in place. So all that being said, South Africa is currently under the leadership of again the ANC, led by Cyril Ramaphosa, who worked in the mining industry. I believe he's a millionaire or a billionaire, one of the two.
Well, they say. I don't know. I don't know. But he was head of the National Union of Mine Workers and also played a key role in the formation of the Congress of South African Trade Unions in December of 1985. And that was a major development in the anti-apartheid struggle because it brought together hundreds of thousands of organized workers who were aligned with the ANC and the Communist Party.
But how do you assess his time in office so far?
Well, I mean, he's followed pretty much the same neoliberal policies, although they have maintained their support of the Palestinians, the people of the Western Sahara, and other progressive and socialist forces throughout the world. For example, in 2023, when the genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza intensified, they took the case of genocide, violation of the Genocide Convention, to the International Court of Justice, the highest legal body of the United Nations, and won a favorable ruling. Now, that was very good symbolically, but the Zionist entity is still carrying out genocidal policies against the Palestinians, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. They also have continued the war in southern Lebanon. They just bombed Beirut again yesterday. And also they've started wars against the people of Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which they probably wish they had not done, considering the outcome of what happened in June of 2025 and more recently, late February to early April of this year, where they really damaged not only the image, but also the infrastructure of the Pentagon and Zionist military structures in West Asia. Like the Fifth Fleet, for example, the Pentagon base in the Kingdom of Bahrain has largely been destroyed as an operational military structure. The United Arab Emirates was heavily hit. So was Jordan, as well as Saudi Arabia. And inside the state of Israel itself, tremendous amount of damage that was done. They exhausted a lot of their missile capacity. And even now, Trump is very reluctant to go back to a full-fledged military operation. There was some bombings that took place earlier this week, and there was also bombings in southern Iran, but there was also attacks by the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, against U.S. Warships and aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf, to the point where they had to withdraw those warships and aircraft carriers to a further distant position from the Strait of Hormuz. So yes, Iran has done a lot of damage to the image of the United States as well as the state of Israel, but they're still in a position to inflict tremendous harm to people in West Asia.
And
So
there's
the
even
situation is going to have to work itself out. Also, Syria, what happened there? How they, after years and years of a maximum pressure campaign and funding counter-revolutionary groups under the guise of bringing democracy to Syria. I mean, these are Al-Qaeda and ISIS groups, which they were framing as democracies, that the government of Bashar al-Assad, led by the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party, collapsed. And after that happened, these counter-revolutionaries came in and took over, but there's still not stability in Syria. And I believe that the resistance will intensify and pose a great challenge to this U.S. and Israeli-backed regime that exists now. Even though they claim to be militant Islamists, they don't throw a rock, let alone fire a shot in the direction of the state of Israel or in the direction of the U.S. troops that are still occupying areas of northeast Syria. So they're clearly a vassal state backed by Zionism and imperialism.
My friend Bernita, who's been on the program many times, she posted on the threads that she thought it was incredible that South Africa took Israel to this high international court, given that Israel was a partner in crime to apartheid South Africa, and I believe South Africa never mentioned once that Israel was complicit in propping up the apartheid government. So
Well,
that
they
being
have acknowledged it. They've acknowledged it. That's why they have such staunch support for the Palestinians, the PLO, and even met with Hamas in later years, in more recent years. Delegations have gone there. They've held conferences where elements outside the Palestinian Authority have attended. So, yeah, they've definitely acknowledged it. And this alliance goes way back to the early days of the World Zionist movement. There's a book by Richard P. Stevens called Weizmann and Smuts. It talks about the alliance between the Afrikaners and the Zionists which later took over West Asia. Yeah.
unbelievable. That's just unbelievable.
Yeah.
But hey,
But that's what you can say about them, though. They still support the Palestinians. They still support the Arab, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic in the Polisario Front in the Western Sahara, despite all the pressure that's being leveled against them. And they are still refusing to bow down to Trump and his lies and his pressure campaigns. Even under Joe Biden, the government, South African government, was being accused of supplying weapons to Russia, the Russian Federation, in the special military operation in Ukraine. So yes, they have maintained their principles also in terms of African unity and the Southern African Development Community, which is a regional unified organization as well.
yes, and both the late Nelson Mandela and Tutu always were supportive of the Palestinians,
Palestinians.
both violently and non-violently, and I
Yeah.
believe it was because of Mandela. Criticisms about Israel, just Israel's treatment towards indigenous Palestinians, why Netanyahu boycotted going to Nelson Mandela's funeral.
Well, that was a good thing. I mean, they
Yeah.
didn't need it there. And when Mandela came to the United States in August of 1990, they tried to trap him on that. Well, first they released the information that the CIA had been instrumental in his capture in order to sabotage his discussions with George H.W. Bush Sr. But, it didn't happen. It didn't happen. They knew what the long-term objectives were. And a lot of people already knew that the CIA had been supporting the apartheid regime. They already knew this. Also, they were involved, the Zionist entity and the United States and federal Germany were involved in the development of at least 6 nuclear weapons that were produced by the Republic of South Africa under the Boers. And these weapons were dismantled in 1993 prior to the conclusion of the negotiations and the upcoming elections that took place in late April of 1994. So they actually helped them develop nuclear weapons. Like Israel now has its estimated hundreds of nuclear warheads, but they won't admit it. They won't, confirm or deny whether they have them. Neither will their backers in the United States confirm or deny the existence of nuclear weapons by the state of Israel.
Yet they had to torture the Israeli whistleblower who exposed all of that, funnily enough.
Yeah, I remember him. Yeah.
Now, regarding South African history during apartheid and the current state of affairs, can you talk to us briefly about what was this white liberal party? Now it's this socially liberal, but I consider them far right libertarian party, a pro capitalist party, regardless of what the free market has done to South Africa, and that is the Democratic Alliance, which was formed out of the ashes of several white South African
Right.
liberal
Right.
parties founded by Helen Suzman, whom Malcolm X would have definitely hated her, and she would have been one of those white liberals he would have often scolded and denounced harshly in his speeches and writings. Now, this Anglo-European Jewish lady was a founding member of all these parties. I'm curious your response, and do they prove that you can't have liberalism or humane capitalism in colonized places like South Africa that experienced harsh racial or racialized capitalism that only produces inequality and extreme hardship for the vast people? And interestingly enough, the DA is a member of Liberal International and the local continent-wide Africa Liberal Network, where various right-wing parties like the MR movement Reformateur of Belgium, the right-leaning Walloon Party. Open VLD is also a member of this party, Open Flemish Liberals, as well as Ivory Coast's Rally for the Republicans. Said Hariri's Future Movement of Lebanon is a member of this, as well as the German FDP, Free Democratic Party, as well as the very right-wing VVD is a member of this party, as well as all these other awful pro-capitalist right-wing parties. So I'm very curious your response to that.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely, in my opinion, right wing and pro-Zionists, and they came out of amalgamation of the Nationalist Party and the other parties that were supposedly to the left of the Nationalist Party among the white community. So make no mistake about it. These people are clearly committed to neoliberalism, and they also do not agree with the ANC's position on unconditional support for the Palestinian struggle for national liberation and unity. So yes, the DA and the leader, the guy who was leading the DA, recently stepped down, and they're going to have to get a new long-term leader. So we'll see how that pans out. And also, we'll see how well they do in the local government elections that are coming up later this year. But they've undergone a lot of turmoil. On two occasions, they had Africans who were ostensibly leaders of the Democratic Alliance, and both of them either resigned or were expelled. So they couldn't even bribe an African to support them, and so they had to go back to white leadership. So we'll see who the next permanent leader of the Democratic Alliance will be.
Unbelievable. And the multinational mining companies of Britain, Australia, Canada, don't know if Israel has a big mining industry, but the U.S. certainly, and whomever of their allies with a strong mining industry talk about how their unspeakable crimes against humanity and little to no workers' rights is still alive and well in South Africa, despite democracy in South Africa. Correct?
Yeah, that was the idea in part behind the Black economic empowerment programs, is to break up the exclusive white ownership and management in the mining industry and other industries in South Africa. The South African mining industry has declined for various reasons. Other countries now produce more gold than what is produced in South Africa. So this has had an impact, but this was done, in my opinion, deliberately after the ANC came to power, and you had such a strong trade union movement in the Congress of South African Trade Unions, which did have a split a decade or so ago. But the offspring of that has not turned out the way that the people who carried out the split thought that it would. So hopefully they can get back together and form a broad a trade union movement in South Africa. It's definitely needed right now.
Yes, and before Ramaphosa got into power, there was the awful massacre of miners by the South African police, mostly black South African police, them arguing for basic worker protection and
Yeah,
workers' rights.
in
So
2010. Yeah,
Marikana massacre,
yeah, massacre. Yeah, in 2010. Yeah, it was awful.
which
Really awful.
which Trevor Noah made fun of and claimed that nobody really knew what was going on about and was literally dancing on the graves of those miners who were slaughtered by their own black governments.
Yeah, I don't know what his problem was. He was on U.S. television for a number of years, and what I'd resented the most resentment was when Trump was refusing to leave office. He was challenging the validity of the 2020 elections in the United States, and he made a statement that Trump was acting like an African leader. Well, no,
Yeah,
Trump is a racist. You know, for centuries, Africans in the United States, the majority of them couldn't even vote, even after the Civil War, even after the passage of the 15th Amendment. So to say that, is a total distortion of U.S. history.
that's Trevor Noah for you, though, who also thinks China's colonizing us. Now, now South Africa is the S in BRICS. Talk about South Africa's role in BRICS, its historical relation and current ones with China, Russia, India, and Brazil, and in general, what is South? Well, you've already sort of explained South Africa's international relations ethos with the continent and the global South. Uh, but but if there's anything else you want to talk about regarding that, do talk about it. And interestingly enough, uh, you were talking about how South Africa stood up for the Palestinian people when the West was threatening to arrest Putin for war crimes regarding the invasion of Ukraine or the special military operation. South Africa said that if Russia ever comes through South Africa, we're not going to arrest him. And one or two diplomats and Ramaphosa himself also mentioned that Russia historically has been a great friend to South Africa. So I thought that was quite interesting.
Yes. So South Africa joined BRICS, after Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And since South Africa joined, a number of other countries have joined. So now the BRICS Plus organization constitutes over half of the U.S., half of the world's population. And this is why Trump is opposed to it. It's why even the Democratic Party is opposed to it. So what they're talking about is de-dollarization.
Yeah.
Uh, to lessen the dependence on the United States dollar as the currency of the global financial system. So I don't think that's going to happen overnight, but just a discussion of it has caused shockwaves inside the world capitalist system.
Incredible. And what has been, briefly, what has been South Africa's response to the African Spring and the anti French wave in West Africa and their response to the US's efforts in building a continent wide AFRICOM?
Mm-hmm. Well, certain political parties are in support of them, in support of the AES, and there was a summit that was held in Kenya a couple of weeks ago, and the president of South Africa did not attend. So I don't think they're in favor of France and its role that's being played on the African continent.
Interesting. And in fact, there's actually going to be a talk. Black Alliance for Peace is holding a web event where Margaret Kimberley, the person whose name I'm blanking out, but he was a longtime journalist for Press TV, founder of African Stream, and now the founder of Sovereign Media, which also
Right.
gets outlets like Orinoco Tribune and Black Agenda Report to work together to do more anti-imperialist Germany. And yeah, they're going to be having to talk about that.
Yeah, that's May 30th.
Yeah.
It'd be very interesting. And I watched the arrest and the gassing of the delegates there when they held a demonstration in Nairobi. But a lot has been going on in Kenya even since that summit, the Pan-African Summit Against Imperialism. There was a transport worker strike just days after that happened, and 4 people were killed. At least 4 people were killed during that strike because people could not afford to buy fuel as a direct result of the U.S.-Israeli unprovoked war against the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has taken control completely of the Strait of Hormuz and is controlling the traffic through that strategic waterway.
And I have to ask this question. Are you shocked that the white supremacist movement that developed and advanced in South Africa, these white supremacists, and these Western chauvinists, they boast about how they are the cradle of civilization. They denigrate African and other achievements of the largely non-white, non-European adjacent worlds. And both Walter Rodney, the late Walter Rodney, and present day historians and anti-imperialists and leftists who are involved in Africa solidarity work, like Eve Engler, have shown how Europe and pan-European empires have deliberately underdeveloped Africa. But in South Africa, why would the Dutch and Anglo settlers deliberately do that to a majority indigenous Black African nation when it seems counterproductive if they are living in largely impoverished, unspeakable, horrific conditions on top of economic exploitation. And yet, in the presidential debates between F.W. de Klerk and Nelson Mandela, I just thought it was shocking to hear F.W. de Klerk, this settler colonialist, talk about the left being too extreme and the issues of poverty and chronic unemployment when the apartheid socioeconomic system and historical colonialism is literally the root of all of these problems. So I'm very curious your response to that.
Well, you literally answered the question in the question. Yeah, because that they are responsible for all of this. And it's the legacy of colonialism, neocolonialism, settler colonialism, and apartheid that Africa is still suffering from up until this day. The dependency that's been fostered by the world capitalist system. That's why countries like Kenya, for example, have to bow down, or they think they have to bow down to the US, to Britain, to Israel, as well as France today. So no, all these systems are bad, and the sooner they are disposed of, the better. And it's horrendous that Kenya right now is trying to form a partnership with France after France has been literally kicked out of the alliance of Sahel states in West Africa. So yes, they are responsible, and they are part and parcel of the world capitalist and imperialist system, and will continue to be so until that system collapses.
But I just find it still quite shocking that that you have this white supremacist mentality and you hate Black people and other people of color. I don't want to again cite the mentality of somebody like that, but okay, you're a racist or a racist, but that they did not even use that wealth to advance basic roads, basic communities across the nation, unless you were in this gated white Anglo-British community or the Afrikaner communities. Can you explain that? How they didn't even want to, develop Yeah, I'm very curious your response.
Yeah, even Walter Rodney in his book that was published over a half century ago points out that the quote development unquote that was done, like the building of railroads, for example, or roads or ports, were all done to foster the profit-making capacity of the transnational corporations and the colonial governments. And that's still going on to this day. We could still see the impact of it up into the 21st century. So no, they're not interested in empowering oppressed people or colonized people or neo-colonized people. They just want to maximize profit for the wealthiest individuals and entities within the Western societies.
And anyone who gets too uppity, you just send your cops and you just have your vice colonial Roy subjects do all the dirty work then, or?
Yeah, to overthrow governments, to undermine governments, destabilize progressive regimes. Yeah, that's exactly what they do.
My second to last question is this: Do you think, despite the ANC, after all these years being in power, not advancing the Freedom Charter at all, that in spite of that, what South Africa needs to eradicate the scourge that is certainly extreme poverty and all the ills that come with that, South Africa needs socialism, Pan Africanist leftism, Marxism, and much of what the Freedom Charter championed in order to address the problems still plaguing the majority, working poor, destitute poor, and precarious middle class, largely Black South Africans, but also the colored community and the South Asian communities.
Most definitely, that's what's needed, and there needs to be a coming together of the groups that split off. If you look at the statistics of it, the ANC got 40% of the popular vote in 2024. You had MK, which is headed by Jacob Zuma. It was a whole big fight over whether or not they could use that name. They got approximately 11, 12% of the vote. And the Economic Freedom Fighters, which is also a split from the ANC, got approximately 8%, 8, 9% of the vote. If you combine that, they would have enough electoral support to form a government, to continue the process of an ANC-dominated government. So they need to try to resolve these splits that have taken place and recapture their electoral capacity and move forward towards what they call the National Democratic Revolution, which was discussed 30 years ago when Mandela came to power.
And then my final question is this: Do you think that white settler colonialists in South Africa got off completely easy? And your response to the racist argument that it's affirmative action in South Africa that's the root cause of all of South Africa's ills? And are you amazed actually at how much us, the colonized people, have actually largely been far too nice and spared white supremacists and their goons? And I often think of the late Colin Mohammed, who late in life was a member of the Nation of Islam. He was kicked out due to a series of highly controversial comments and statements he made, and he later founded the new Black Panther Party. He said, South Africans don't and shouldn't have been forced to live with their oppressors. He called for a genocide of all white people in South Africa, which I certainly don't endorse, and also said controversial comments about how the Jews had their Nurembergs, whereas our Johannesburg, and he really admired Winnie Mandela and strongly scolded Nelson Mandela for throwing her under the bus. And, when we think of the liberation of Algeria and then historic Palestine, the calls for a democratic, secular, one-state solution for historic Palestine, which I think BDS, if it was seriously used, we could see, a radical decolonization process in historic Palestine. Very curious your response to all of what I just said.
Yeah, well, that was just talk on the part of people like Khalid Muhammad. They never killed anybody. In fact, somebody tried to kill him, a former member of the Nation of Islam who he had a fight with in some years before. So, I wouldn't take his rhetoric too seriously. None of the liberation movements in Africa have taken that position. The ones that did wage armed struggles, who were able to seize power, even in Algeria, in Angola, and Mozambique, and so forth. So, you got to have the organization, you got to have the internal cohesiveness, and you also have to have international support for any type of revolutionary movement.
And but do you think that putting aside the calls for a white genocide, that Khalid Mohammed was right in that our people have been far too kind to global white supremacy and so
Mhm.
forth, uh, what's really needed in any country like what South Africa has gone through is
Mhm.
it is really actually that Algeria treatment, which is you either live in peace with the people you've colonized, you the settler colonialists, and if you're not interested in that, well, then you're free to go back to France and so forth. And I almost think that that those of us in the Palestine liberation movement who advocate for BDS, it needs to be with strings attached. We advocate BDS, and either the Zionist entity accepts a democratic, secular, one-state solution, and if they're not interested, well, you're more than free to go back to where your grandparents and your great grandparents came from. I'm very curious.
Well, a lot of them have left, even before Trump came out with these myths about a white genocide. A lot of them did leave. Some came to this country. They went to other European countries. So yes, in that regard, a lot of them have left, even under the Portuguese colonial system. There were a lot of Portuguese nationals living in South Africa because they thought, they would protect white supremacy. That didn't happen either. So yes, but no, I don't. Even in Palestine, we'll see what the outcome has been. But even a lot of Jewish people have left since October of 2023 and returned to the United States or gone to other countries because they don't feel safe in that occupied territory. But yes, people who have organized revolutions, who have organized armed struggles and popular resistance that have been successful, none of them have put forward the positions that some people based in this country have, who have not been able to successfully organize, uh, armed struggles and seizure of power, even on a minimal basis. I mean,
Interesting.
Malcolm X left the Nation of Islam in 1964 due to its lack of activity, due to its reluctance to become involved in the mass struggle of the African American people. So, I mean, that is the reality of history. And,
Interesting.
others like Khalid Muhammad, for example, um, remained in the Nation of Islam. When it went down under Wharf Dean Muhammad, and then when Farrakhan revitalized it in the late 1970s, he hooked up with Farrakhan until they fell out during the mid 1990s, I believe, when that happened.
Interesting.
But
Yep.
I mean, even the concept of a new Black Panther Party really is a misnomer because they did not accept the politics of the Black Panther Party at all. That's not the politics of the Black Panther Party that was advocated by Khalid Muhammad and others who have come to the fore since his passing.
Yes, and I believe I don't even think it's even anymore in existence. And if it is, they don't believe in divorcing completely from white America and having their own black state.
Separate state, yeah, right, right. Even the Nation of Islam does not advocate that now.
Yeah.
They may it may be somewhere written in a program, but that's not their principal focus at this time.
And that is a topic that we are definitely going to return to. I hope in the future because it's an interesting one, and it goes into a lot of the sometimes deep divisions which happen behind closed doors between what is liberation. And I know that Glenn Ford said that in the black community, just in the U.S. alone, there is tension between those who what he called self determinationists and those who are integrationists. And so one of these days we should definitely have a
Mhm.
discussion on that because it is
Yeah,
fascinating and so forth.
yeah, right.
Well, we were joined on this edition of One Plus One with our always wonderful historical guide, our tour guide, Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan African Newswire and Black Agenda Report, a longtime independent journalist, historian, Pan Africanist leftist, and activist involved in anti imperialist campaigns in Africa's solidarity. Do check out the work of both Pan African Newswire and Black Agenda Report. Subscribe to them and the work of Black Alliance for Peace, and a remind which is having an online event tomorrow, which I'll post the link, and a reminder to check out the playlists of this series with Abayomi and other great informative stuff on Africa, and do share it widely. And again, folks, donate generously to One Plus One. Please share us widely, and don't forget to check out the Eclectic Radical. Become a Patreon over there. Help out my friend and colleague Chris, who's facing unemployment. The next country that we are going to explore is Namibia. Very excited for that. Please join us for that. And until then, folks, good night and good luck. Have a great weekend. And see you all next week.